Religious freedom is the first freedom because you can't have freedom without virtue. And those who are supposed to call us into virtue are not government officials, but the mediating institutions that exist outside of the government, families, churches.
And I think many people in our society are beginning to see the process is the punishment. Even if you win the case in the end, the case is in the cultural conversation, and it's saying to other people who share the same views, keep quiet, otherwise this is going to happen to you.
It's worth remembering that in the last truly titanic struggle, World War II, the king himself, at a dark moment, called the nation to prayer. You can go on YouTube and see queues of people for miles waiting to get into their church to pray. The soul of the nation was still willing to say prayer matters and to actually embrace it. Now we've got to the point where prayer can be seen as an act of hate.
So in terms of the process becoming the punishment, this is Exhibit A. This is over 5 years of someone's life dragged through criminal courts for simply expressing their deeply held beliefs.
Those have been arrested or investigated and also criminally charged for silently praying. These are essentially thought crimes that the UK is pursuing.
We're talking today about religious freedom, which is actually a far more important issue than many people might realise in the supposedly, in commas, secular age. And John Steenhof is the principal lawyer of the Human Rights Law Alliance in Australia. Kristen Waggoner is the CEO and General Counsel of Alliance Defending Freedom, the world's largest legal organisation defending freedom of religion and speech. And Paul Coleman is Executive Director of ADF International, based in Vienna, and he specialises in international human rights and European law. Os Guinness posits that religious freedom, which very few people pay enough attention to, is actually the most fundamental of all of our freedoms. Most of our listeners would say, how could it be? Surely it's freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or whatever. Why freedom of religion?
Religious freedom is the first freedom because you can't have freedom without virtue. And those who are supposed to call us into virtue are not government officials, but the mediating institutions that exist outside of the government, families, churches. And it also recognizes the concept of religious freedom itself, recognizes there are limits to government, that there is a higher duty that we owe to a creator, and that creator in and of himself puts limits on the role of government. And so I think that's why it's so important that we recognize that yes, we have the right to explore the meaning of life, to peacefully live consistent with the answers that we find, and by its very nature, that produces good citizens.
I think that in addition to that fantastic statement, freedom of religion is the most important freedom because it connects to the most important thing. It connects to the divine. And so for believers, if God is real, if God exists, then our ability to connect to God, to worship God, is the most important thing about us, and therefore it's the most important freedom.
It reflects the fact that everyone is ultimately religious. Everyone has a conviction about who we are, about why we're here, about what the good life is. So freedom of religion often is seen as the pet topic for the religious, the Christian, but it is so much wider than that because it extends to anyone who wants to be able to freely express their views about what they believe deeply. And it's inherently a Christian concept. It's developed in the West through the nations that have been deeply influenced by Christianity because we believe in the imago Dei, the image of God that is in every human being that gives them inherent dignity. And the idea is that if we compel people to believe things, if we impose upon their consciences, that does a great injustice to the image of God in them. And so it's important not just for those who say they have beliefs, but also for the rest of society as well.
I think in your answer to that initial question, you raised something that I think is important, which is that all of us, if we're thoughtful and reflective human beings, and that's most of us, will at some stage want to explore the big questions. Who am I? Is there any significance in my life? Do I mean anything? What is my purpose? What is the chief end, if you like, of my existence, or is it all pointless? And that means you need to be able to explore those things, including by drawing on the best and the worst thinking out there so that you can form a view of your own and establish your own conscience.
Absolutely, and therefore freedom of religion and then closely associated freedom of speech, it requires the ability to have this free flow of information, to impart information to others, and that's very much part of the Christian tradition to make disciples of all nations, to be Christ's witnesses, but also then to receive information, to have access to that information in the pursuit of truth ultimately, and what is the meaning of life.
Os Guinness would put it, I think, that there are several freedoms that we talk about, all perhaps of equal importance. So you might say freedom of speech, that's the one everyone mentions. Freedom of assembly, to meet with people or not meet with people, in fact to discriminate. So, no, here are the people I want to my dinner party and I don't want others. Or matters of much greater gravitas. Private property, conscience and belief. But he would say that there is a chronological order. That in fact it was in this country, not so far away from here, for example, that the idea emerged in England after people were burned at the stake for their beliefs, burnt alive for what they believed. Think of the memorial in Oxford to Latimer, Cranmer and Ridley. And after a while people realised that it was hardly Christian to burn somebody for having a different view. It was not very smart, because today's minority might end up being tomorrow's majority. Mob rule is not a good way to approach things. But thirdly, it was hardly a Christian way to treat others. And so the genius of living together with our deepest differences on the basis of respect for others, even if you disagree with them, became central to our very civilization. And so by implication, to cut off that wellspring of our freedoms as they've emerged in the West is to retreat from our civilizational roots.
The journey towards religious freedom was a long journey in the West, and indeed we see instances where you have the burning at the stake of Latimer and Ridley, and the inter-religious wars that we see in Europe, but that was a journey towards the freedoms that we enjoy now and the premium that we place on the dignity of every human being and the rights of them to live according to their conscience within a free society. And unfortunately, as we now see the rejection of the Christian basis for our Western governments, and we return to almost a new religion with the cultural Marxism and wokeness, we're seeing a return to that intolerance and that cancel culture that is largely resonant of the persecutions that we saw in a prior age. So it's a step backwards when we step away from the cherishing of religious freedom as a fundamental freedom and move towards a hostile and aggressive secularism that excludes Christianity and religion from the public square.
Can I put a suggestion to you that perhaps it's not the new secularism, because the new secularism in many ways is driven by a new religion. You're actually seeing the re-emergence of religious intolerance.
It indeed does have the character of religion, but this new religion is quite different from Christianity. It has no mercy, it has no forgiveness, it has no way back into reconciliation in the way that Christianity did. And I think many people in our society are beginning to see that this is not a step forward, this is not part of the great arc of progress, but that there's something that needs to be recovered in this area of religious freedom.
I think it also is lacking, what you see in religions is an allegiance to a higher power. There is no allegiance to a higher power in this current ideology. The higher power is oneself. It's a radical autonomy that places feelings and self-perception above anything else, which naturally crushes dissent. because if you offend me, what my perception of myself is or my feelings, by its very nature, it can't tolerate that freedom of speech or that offense, and so it crushes it. And so I do think you could call it a quasi-religion, but again, it is so focused on a radical autonomy, and it abandons any objective truth or higher power.
I think, to what Kristen's saying, this is a unique moment in history. Think of the work of Philip Reith, and it was popularized by Carl Trueman, and he talks about these three worlds. The first world, where there was an appeal to fate, so there was still an appeal to an external authority. And then we had the world, Christianity and so forth, where it went from, as Trueman says, from fate to faith, but again, an appeal to a higher authority beyond ourselves. And then what's emerged in these recent times is no appeal to a higher authority, but as Kristen said, an appeal to oneself. And the point that Reith makes, and then Trueman, is that civilization can't sustain that. Ultimately, that will collapse on itself, and I think we're seeing the emergence of a lot of that across the Western world.
I agree with that, because surely, as I said a moment ago, we've got to hold the door open as people recognise how empty and hollow modern life has become, and how inadequate we are to try and play God over our own lives. We're not up to the task. People must start looking again. And the objectors to religious freedom shouldn't be allowed to cut off those options as people start to seek again, because surely they will. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that's happening right now. New atheism has well and truly peaked, and you've got people like Justin Brearley pointing to the fact that there is a major reconsideration in a lot of circles of the matter of faith.
Well, we were told that we were being ushered into a new age of materialistic atheism, and that would do away with the fear and the superstition of a bygone religious age. But we're seeing entirely the opposite is true, that we've never been more anxious and more fearful, having deserted God. And so the culture is really hungry to see something that gives an answer to this fear and to this anxiety, and realizing that having thrown away this religion that underpinned this appeal to the transcendent, people are ready to re-engage with the transcendent.
We're talking in Europe, and recently the new Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, gave a fairly interesting, shall we say, and provocative, those are two words you could use, speech in Munich. He challenged Europeans to examine themselves, Europe to examine herself, if you like, and to return to the ideals of democracy and liberty that it once held. Can I get briefly your impressions of that speech and what it represents in relation to fundamental freedoms?
Well, I'll go first as the European amongst us, because I think another word that I would use to describe the speech was fantastic, and I think potentially historical. It was almost, as a European, like a prophet was coming from a foreign land to tell us what we already knew, but seemingly needed reminding of. And so I think that it was obviously within the European political elites, they're sort of furious and there's a huge backlash. But just one level below that, I have seen huge positivity towards what Vice President Vance was saying, and really seeing it as a clarion call, as a wake-up call to Europeans as to where we are at this moment in history.
I'd be interested in your perspective from America.
Yes, I was deeply encouraged by his comments. I think that we, first of all, the work that we're doing internationally and in the UK, we are seeing firsthand the real victims, the human cost that comes from censorship. We are also living in an age where censorship is no longer, I would say, limited to geography, that it impacts the entire world because of the digital age. And so I think a recognition of that is important too. And having Vice President Vance highlight one of our cases meant I know so much to be seen by those victims who have been criminally convicted for silently praying. And then I would also add, I think it's also encouraging to me to hear that many times as we speak words, we may be speaking them to someone else to call them up, but we're also calling America up, because while we're seeing more censorship abroad through the Digital Services Act and things like that, we do see censorship on American soil as well, and we need to return to our roots to ensure that all people can speak and love the truth.
Kristen, could we come to some of the actual issues that the Vice President raised? He talked about people not being allowed to pray in their own homes under British law in certain circumstances. He said some very wide-ranging things about practices in Europe that are anti-freedom, if I can put it that way. Give us a bit of detail on some of the things that he said so that people understand what he was driving at.
Well, I also think it's important, as we're talking about free speech, to recognize religious freedom and free speech are intertwined. You really can't have one without the other. And so in these instances of silent prayer, these are people that feel that they should be praying to a higher authority and seeking help and praying for others. So they're living by their duty to God, exercising their religious freedom, and at the same time, they're having their speech curtailed. So we have a number of cases in the UK where situations where those have been arrested or investigated and also criminally charged for silently praying. These are essentially thought crimes that the UK is pursuing. We have a case in Mexico that is involving convictions for gender political violence, which essentially is dealing with a man essentially saying that men don't have a right to go into women's spaces. Right now, Paul is litigating a case in Finland at the Finnish Supreme Court on behalf of a parliamentarian, and essentially she's been crimed under initially was charged under a War Crimes Act, which he could certainly share more about. And then on the US side, I would also just emphasize we continually to fight case after case all the way up to the Supreme Court to honor the rights of Americans to, for example, not have to identify someone as the opposite sex, to not be compelled to secretly transition children, for religious churches to be able to speak the truth and to serve others, and certainly pro-life advocates. So there are cases around the world that we're litigating, and the US is not immune to those threats, but they do impact real people. One example in the US, for example, is Jack Phillips of Masterpiece Cake Shop. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. He declined to create a cake that expressed a message that violated his convictions. And we have had to fight 30-some cases in order to again affirm the right for people, regardless of what your views are on a particular issue, to be able to peacefully express those views and not be compelled to say something that you don't mean, because that betrays the human conviction and conscience.
You've seen a lot of those, sometimes just simply vexatious cases, I suspect, in Australia. And can you give us a feel for some of the cases that you've fought?
So these are problems that are common across the Anglosphere. And Australia is not immune to the use of law to try to silence and to chill speech. The cases that we fight typically involve hate speech laws or vilification laws. At the moment, we're representing a breastfeeding counsellor who's being pursued by a trans-identifying man because she has said that men cannot breastfeed. And that is seen as being offensive to those in the trans community who have taken steps to be able to breastfeed. And this is used really to silence her from speaking up for the rights of women. This activist is the same person who got this, our client, Jasmine, kicked out of the Australian Breastfeeding Association for using such hateful terms as breastfeeding rather than chest feeding, mother rather than lactating parent. And it really is just one of those instances where the law is weaponized to shut down speech that is there but that is being used to protect women, to protect children. We have cases that we're running for Lyle Shelton. He is a political activist who wrote an article saying drag queens should not be telling stories to children in public libraries, that it introduces them to concepts of gender fluidity that are confusing, that are contributing to the confusion that our children are experiencing. He again has been taken through court by these drag queens for hate speech, for saying that they are dangerous role models for children. We've defended that case for Lyle. We've won that case for him, and yet now the case is on appeal. And in many of these cases, the process is the punishment. Even if you win the case in the end, The case is in the cultural conversation, and it's saying to other people who share the same views, keep quiet, otherwise this is going to happen to you. And it's exactly these kinds of laws that are anti-religious freedom, anti-free speech, anti the free exchange of ideas, which J.D. Vance was addressing in his speech.
And I think that there's simply so many cases happening now. So we talk about Europe, the US, Australia, 3 different continents, so many different cases that it takes an act of willful blindness and denial to claim that none of this is happening. And so my own case that we've been working on now, arguably the biggest free speech case in Europe at the moment, is again an example of the process being the punishment, because it's 5 years and counting since I went to Helsinki, Finland to meet with parliamentarian Päivi Räsänen, who's been a member of parliament for almost 30 years. She's a former government minister, Minister of the Interior, and she was charged with hate speech for taking a picture of some Bible verses and posting it on social media. It happened when the church that she's a member of, her husband is a minister in that church. They became an official sponsor of a pride parade in Helsinki in 2019. And Päivi was concerned about her church sponsoring this, and so spoke out with a picture of some Bible verses. Very limited act of hers, but it was enough to get the attention of the police. And they then went back through almost 20 years of her speech in public life. They found a booklet that she wrote in 2004 on the Christian view of marriage and human sexuality, and they charged her for that as well. And then a radio show, much like this one, debating these different issues, they took 2 minutes out of context and created a third criminal charge for that as well. As a result of these 3 actions, she has spent over 5 years now being pursued through the Finnish criminal courts. She was indicted, prosecuted, she was acquitted at first trial instance, she was then acquitted on appeal, and now the Finnish general prosecutor, the highest prosecutor in the country, has taken that case to the Supreme Court of Finland, where it will be heard later this year. And so in terms of the process becoming the punishment, this is Exhibit A. This is over 5 years of someone's life dragged through criminal courts for simply expressing their deeply held beliefs.
I can't help reflecting, we've been here at ARC, we've been talking about our civilisational moment. Can we secure our freedoms? As an illustration of just how we've shifted, it's worth remembering that in the last truly titanic struggle for freedom versus tyranny, World War II, the king himself, at a dark moment when there were 300,000 English troops caught on the other side of the channel, Nazi tanks advancing towards them, the Luftwaffe attacking them from the air, called the nation to prayer. You can go on YouTube and see queues of people for miles waiting to get into their church to pray. And fascinatingly, of course, what happened was that it was thought that the English army would have lost. All 300,000 made it back because, strangely, the English Channel settled down in a way that it doesn't normally, so little boats could operate, the skies clouded over, and so the German Air Force couldn't attack, and Hitler, for reasons still not understood by historians today, stopped his tanks. It was an extraordinary thing. It was called at the time the miracle of Dunkirk. The soul of the nation was still willing to say prayer matters and to actually embrace it. Now we've got to the point where prayer can be seen as an act of hate.
So my grandmother remembers that story. She was a school child, she's in her mid-90s now, and she recalls being a school child being called to pray for this miracle, for the miracle of Dunkirk. And actually I was driving through Dunkirk just a couple of months ago, so I stopped at the Operation Dynamo Museum that's there, and I picked up a little postcard. It was a postcard that the Germans, the Luftwaffe, was dropping over the whole area surrounding Dunkirk. And it's a map, and it shows the German army surrounding Dunkirk, and then in English, in writing, it says, "You are completely surrounded, surrender now." So I picked up this postcard, and I have it on my office wall. And the reason for that is it's a great reminder that right in that moment, as grim and terrible as things seemed, there was this huge miracle, there was this huge turnaround. And I think the analogy for us today is that no matter how bleak things may sometimes seem in the culture, in politics, in the law, that these turnarounds have happened throughout history and can happen in our time as well.
Well, you've actually been writing about the rise of hate speech legislation in Europe. Firstly, how can you ever define hate speech? And secondly, just how great a threat does it actually constitute to our freedoms?
Well, you can't define hate speech, and this is the fundamental problem with hate speech legislation. And so essentially what happened is that instead of taking an objective legal standard which would have protected the right of freedom of expression, which would have been something like incitement to violence, the European nations over the last half century adopted, instead of a free speech standard of incitement to violence or something like that, this idea of incitement to hatred was an undefinable concept. How can you define hate? And so because there is no objective and understood definition of what incitement to hatred or hate speech means, it's therefore interpreted by those who are in power. And it gives them huge leeway to say that whatever speech they disagree with, whatever speech goes against the status quo, can be labelled and called hate speech and therefore prosecuted. And in the case of Päivi Räsänen, she's being prosecuted under a hate speech law, and she says, and has said to me, she totally rejects this characterization of what she said. She said it was love speech. It was loving what she said, and she believes that, and yet the prosecutor, those in power, say that it is hate speech. And so this creates a huge threat to freedom of expression everywhere where hate speech legislation is adopted, because ultimately and over time it is used by those in power to censor views that go against the status quo, or to go against the cultural orthodoxies of the day.
To come to our own country, John, it seems to me that many citizens have been, if you like, punished through the process and sometimes actually lost cases at court for saying things that are absolutely of almost no consequence beside the vile speech we've heard, frankly, from some Muslim pulpits in Australia about the Jewish people and the chanting on the streets. If that's not hate speech, nothing is. What's more, it seems to me it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that it's meant to incite violence, but the laws proved absolutely hopelessly inadequate to the task of defending the Jewish people from anti-Semitism in Australia.
It's not the laws that have been found wanting in combating anti-Semitic speech that we've seen in Australia, particularly from Muslim pulpits. It is the willpower of the police and the prosecutors to actually enforce the laws that we already have on the books. But the real scary thing is that in response to this anti-Semitism, our government has passed new hate speech laws which have dismantled many of the protections that we have for ordinary, reasonable speech. They say never waste a good crisis. And what's happened in the recent session of Parliament is the rushing through of some hate speech laws which were supported by both parties, which go far beyond addressing anti-Semitism and which are going to be a real problem for people who are trying to speak up against some of the pervasive ideologies of our times. So we all saw the burning of synagogues, the spray painting of the homes of prominent Jewish citizens, the insults that were hurled at Jews. But did you see any pride centres being hit with bombs or being fired? Did you see any LGBT centres that were the subject of spray paint? I didn't. And yet these new laws have crowbarred into them the identitarian obsessions of our modern politics by not only protecting race and religion, but also saying you cannot speak ill of people of sexual orientation and gender identities that are protected. And so by doing that, and by dismantling the protections that we had in our hate speech laws, I'm confident we're going to see what we've been seeing in Europe under their hate speech laws, which is that the police are now able to come to your door and say, we need to talk to you about your thoughts. We need to talk to you about what you've been posting on the internet. This could land you up to 7 years in prison. And these are not laws that are going to uphold the ability of Australians to speak and live the truth.
That in itself is truly chilling. But if I understand you correctly, you're saying that we had laws that could have been used but were not. Prosecutors and police somehow or other unwilling, reluctant to act?
Correct. We have asymmetrical application of these laws all the time. Quite prominent in our news just recently was 2 nurses at a Sydney hospital who were on a social media app boasting about the fact that they kill Jewish patients. This made the news everywhere around the world.
Everywhere around the world. Everyone's heard it.
Now,
well done.
2, 3, 4 days later, the Chief of Police in New South Wales, when asked, are you going to arrest these 2 nurses? Are you going to enforce these hate speech laws? Said, we are still waiting to collate information on this case. No action is being taken. They're being very cautious. Contrast that with identitarian politics. There was an AFL football game in Australia where one of the Indigenous players claimed that his 12-year-old had called him a monkey or had made a racial slur from the audience, from the crowd. The police had that person arrested and taken in for questioning within 2 hours of that report being made. And yet, contrast that with the most vile expressions of actual violence towards Jews. You see the asymmetrical application of these laws depending on the ideological popularity of the cause. It's very concerning because these laws are never applied in the way that those who pass them would suggest they should be or intended them to be.
Kristen, Trump's return to the White House, I understand he's been making noises about defending religious freedom, even having a proper inquiry into the state of religious freedom. Is that correct? And are you feeling optimistic that the issue might be being taken, can I say, not just more seriously, but more realistically? Or was that pie in the sky hope?
I don't think it's pie in the sky. Certainly President Trump is using the executive powers in ways that we believe are consistent with civil liberties and protecting religious freedom and free speech to the extent that he can. Right now, those are through executive orders, and in our system of government, those executive orders then get translated to the agency level and are supposed to be enforced through guidance and regulations. He has issued a number of executive orders that, again, affirm the right of Americans to be able to practice their faith freely. And in particular, he's even issued one that deals with anti-Christian bias and how that's playing out across the United States. So we are optimistic in terms of the federal government's role over these next 4 years in, again, reestablishing the importance of these liberties. But in a system that believes in separation of powers and also in federalism, we have a whole host of local and state officials that continue to do all they can to impair the right of religious organizations and people to be able to practice their faith. So I think you'll continue to see litigation go up, as many of our cases have gone up in the past to the Supreme Court for religious discrimination, and you'll see the courts need to intervene in those cases. But you will also see the U.S. government switch sides in those cases now to those who are on the side of true freedom.
Let's pose a hypothetical here for a moment. And I want to draw a distinction because we perhaps haven't emphasised, it's been in our discussion, but it's a very important one, that there is a clear distinction to be made between free speech and speech which incites violence. So that's an important distinction to make. We're all against speech that incites violence, and it ought to be rigorously defined, and courts should be aware of their responsibilities in that area. But can I pose a hypothetical based on what John said about what's happened in Australia? if a leading imam in America, and then if I can ask it in a typical European country, were to celebrate the butchery of October the 7th, to refer to Jewish people as the children of pigs and as monkeys, so you're seeing there, foul language, and I would argue incitement to violence. What would happen in America? Would anyone take that to court? Would there be any action? How would that stand up?
Well, your hypothetical isn't quite so hypothetical in that that's the state of many of our public campuses in the last 6 months or so ago. So we did see those kinds of things. But American law is very robust in protecting speech, even speech that is absolutely disgusting and horrific and deeply offensive. And so there are mechanisms in place where there are exceptions to that First Amendment, like true incitement to imminent violence. And so it would depend on the particular facts and circumstances of the case. But as we saw in those campus protests, there were also a number of other laws that were broken during those times. You can't destroy property. You can't be in locations that are not public locations. Governments can put in reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions in the United States on where speech can occur on public property. And similar to what John was sharing, what you saw with the United States authorities, was the state authorities and the campus authorities, they weren't enforcing the legal mechanisms that they already have for the acts, the conduct that was breaking the law as opposed to the speech. And I think that's an important distinction that we make. I also think it's important to bring out at bottom with these hate speech laws and this deplorable speech that you talk about, it may not be a perfect system, but the counter to that is handing over the right to government authorities to arbitrate truth and to silence their critics. And that's what they do. It's not even about necessarily the cultural moment of the day as much as it is silencing critics. And that's where you get into losing our right to even have democracy.
I do think one of the things, I think as a general principle, letting the sunlight in is often the way to fix a festering sore. And I would think one of the things that has to be said about our country is that this latest incident with the nurses will have truly shocked the Australian people. And there are some in the Islamic world, there's no other way of putting this, need to realise that their overreach is going to produce a real reaction. And it's time our political leaders took firmer control of this, or it'll result in deep social division and very unhappy outcomes indeed. There's a real lack of political leadership. Can I ask you the hypothetical question? How might that play out in, for example, Germany, which has, of course, still, and appropriately so, great sensitivity over the Holocaust?
Well, Europe, every single country in Europe has such a litany of laws that could hypothetically prosecute this sort of speech, this sort of behaviour. But to what John was saying, we have the emergence of what is being called in the British context two-tier policing. In fact, our Prime Minister is now known as two-tier Keir for this reason. And so what we see is such vaguely worded, and they really are, these hate speech laws, extremely vaguely worded, very broad in how they're formulated. So what this allows for is arbitrary enforcement. And so we have these laws being arbitrarily enforced in line with what those in power want. And the fact of the matter is that those in power in Europe are terrified of dealing with some of the challenges related to integration of Muslims across the continent. And so what we've seen, and I've documented this in the research that we've done in the cases that we have, is a lot of these hate speech laws are being applied against Christians, including things such as we've already talked about, silent prayer or pictures of Bible verses and so forth. So it's hard to answer the hypothetical because on the one hand, the laws would allow for this sort of thing to happen. On the other hand, we see this two-tier policing where in fact what's happening is these laws are being applied against Christians and others for speaking out against other issues in our society.
And just maybe because I'm sitting in the American chair here, I do also want to emphasize that the two-tiered system is wrong, and in our system it would violate equal protection and the due process of law and things like that. But even if it wasn't a two-tiered system, it's wrong. And that there are so many reasons why we should be giving a robust defense of free speech. It allows us to speak the truth, to expose lies. It allows social progress. The most fundamental civil rights movements that we've had have been against what government authorities have wanted and against the cultural moment. So again, while it puts us to hearing things we don't want to hear, deeply offensive speech, if it doesn't cross into the line of imminent incitement to violence or into conduct, there are strong reasons to protect that speech. And statistics, social studies tell us that when you allow robust free speech, you will have stronger, more stable democracies and societal progress in a way that you otherwise don't. So I think the two-tiered system is wrong, but even if it wasn't a two-tiered system, it is still wrong to impinge on the right to speak one's mind peacefully.
John, if I could come to a couple of Australian issues, and there may be a European and American perspectives on it, but at the time of the postal poll that led to the legalisation of same-sex marriage in Australia, the Prime Minister said that to him, religious freedom was even more important than the freedom for gay people to marry. Years on, it's never been delivered in the sense that it was promised. What's the state of play in Australia on religious freedom?
In Australia, over the last 60 years, we've seen the asymmetrical legislation of only grievance rights, only discrimination rights, at the expense of the protection of foundational freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And so these have a disproportionate presence on our law books. And that has meant that people's views of what the importance of religious freedom has changed as anti-discrimination has taken a hold of the consciousness. Instead of freedom of speech being a right that sits alongside the right against discrimination, people look at the churches, look at Christians and say, when you ask for free speech, you're asking for a free ride that other people don't get. You're asking for the right to discriminate. And so what we're seeing is incrementally those freedoms are being largely eroded by social engineering legislation like the same-sex marriage laws, like the laws for anti-conversion therapy that stop preachers from giving a Christian view of anthropology and the human being and who we truly are as humans. Like the safety laws that we have, the online safety laws that we have, the hate speech laws that we have, each of those are increasingly impinging on the rights of Christians and other Australian citizens to speak in the public square against the prevailing narratives that are often so damaging to our society.
Well, on that, the Vice President in his speech warned of e-safety commissars, if I can put that word, shutting down information and public debate in this new age of the internet and technology. How real is that, firstly in Europe and America and then in Australia, that threat? We have an e-safety commissioner. Should we be concerned in Australia? But we'll come to I'd appreciate your perspectives first.
So we have seen that on the one hand we have these criminal hate speech laws across the Western world. In the last decade we've had sort of the other side of the censorship coin, which is a lot of misinformation, disinformation laws rise up. In a nutshell, what happened, I think, is that in the digital age we had a period of relative freedom online throughout the 90s and the 2000s. And then we saw these social media platforms launch and everyone was sharing their ideas, and this was all generally seen as a good thing until around about 2016 something happened on either side of the Atlantic. So here in Europe we had Brexit, in the US we had the election of Donald Trump. Neither of these two political events were expected by the political elites, by the media class. It was shocking, both sides of the Atlantic. And so rather than those elites self-reflect and think, maybe we're out of touch, or how did this happen? The narrative they told themselves was that this happened because essentially the people were tricked, because they had received misinformation and disinformation that led to those undesirable political outcomes. And so what we see from around about the 2016 period is this terminology skyrocketed. You can see that's documented, thousands of % increase in this terminology. And also the laws of a lot of different countries started passing misinformation, disinformation laws to essentially restrict speech, particularly online. And so for the last 9 years or so, together with these laws, an entire infrastructure has been laid out. It's been coined the censorship industrial complex.
Good grief.
And it is this interweb of public actors, so the government, outsourcing essentially censorship to private actors through the social media platforms, the fact checkers, the content moderators, and so forth. All of this happened at the advent of artificial intelligence, what has been dubbed then as weapons of mass deletion. The technology then existed to mass censor online. And so essentially, over the last decade, this industrial complex of censorship has risen up across the Western world. And now we're only just starting to see the fruits of that with some of the censorship that we're seeing. So the structures have been secretly laid in place, and it's only now coming to light what that is going to look like. The pinnacle of it is the European Union's Digital Services Act. This is a huge piece of legislation, 116 pages, 100 references to what it refers to as illegal content, which is not defined in the Act. And it sets up a censorship industrial complex for Europe in writing. It basically lays out how it's going to do this. And then it seeks to claim jurisdiction, essentially, for the whole world. And so this has only just come in force. And I think that based on what different European leaders are saying, every time they hear something that they don't like, we're going to see under the Digital Services Act censorship across the European Union, and they will attempt to do so in the US and around the world as well.
So I would say the case that we're supporting in Australia is a great example of how it will happen and occur across the world, including affecting the American situation. So we're supporting the case involving a gentleman who has spent significant time with street advocacy, essentially saying gender identity is wrong, that it harms children. And when he posted something on X that essentially expressed some disapproval over a WHO appointment to an important position, it's my understanding that the Australian commissar said to take that down. And he's a Canadian, so it's a Canadian citizen that's sharing a post on X on an American platform about an Australian, essentially. And in doing so, the censorship that occurred extended beyond even Australia's boundaries. And I think that's a good example of, in America, we don't necessarily need the commissars to censor the speech, because we have algorithms, we have a collusion between big tech and big government to use the formulas to censor the speech. And the last thing that I would say, well, two things. One is we've had two cases in this last Supreme Court term that involved this corrosive, toxic collaboration. One was where a state government official pressured different banks to essentially put regulations in place and take away the right of, for example, the NRA to be able to do business and have insurance. And so that collusion was behind the scenes to force the government, force a private actor to do something. The second involved COVID and censorship about COVID online. And again, the Biden White House pressuring companies to censor speech in these areas, all behind the scenes in the shadows. And they were successful in doing that. And Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress and essentially admitted to this pressure. And then the last thing I would say that we're seeing in the US, but I think it is also, I've heard stories in the UK and other places, of debanking as another form of censorship to chill speech and religious views. In that we are seeing big tech, big government collude, and big banks together to say, if you're voicing certain conservative views or religious views or political views, we will deny you access to the market, access to capital, and we will debank you. It's happened to our clients around the world. It has also happened to President Trump's wife, Melania Trump, and to Barron Trump. I believe it's happened to Nigel Farage. It's happened to a number of leaders who happen to be on the wrong side, which is another new form of censorship that we haven't seen in the past.
Pretty amazing in an age that says the truth's all relative. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. We're living in a new age of absolutism, where people with the power and influence absolutely seek to impose their morality on others. This is astounding stuff. The E-Commissioner in Australia, you'll have some views.
Well, Ronald Reagan said the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Well, in the mid-21st century, I think the 11 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to keep you safe." Because under the guise of keeping people safe from harms online, we're seeing an incredible increase in censorship by government agencies. Non-elected bureaucrats, these are managerial technocrats who've been appointed to these positions under laws like our Online Safety Act, which was passed 2 years ago, which establishes the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner. Ostensibly, that was a law that was there to protect children, protect them from harms on the internet, which is indeed a noble cause that all of us can support. However, crowbarred into that law was another offence, which is cyber abuse of an Australian adult. And the E-Safety Commissioner has been using those provisions to censor the social media platforms and issue takedown notices such as against our client, Billboard Chris. This is the case that Kristen was talking about just a second ago, where this Canadian citizen who has been engaging in activism by wearing a billboard that says children cannot consent to puberty blockers has also been posting on X regularly about movements around the world in relation to children's gender medicine. Now, an Australian activist was appointed to a WHO committee that's going to be setting trans guidelines. So Billboard Chris made an X post linking to an Australian article which exposed a variety of indecent posts that this trans activist had put on their own Facebook page, and then said, people who belong in psychiatric wards shouldn't be making the rules for people who belong in psychiatric wards. Well, that led to a complaint. The E-Safety Commissioner has issued a formal takedown notice to X and required that to be geo-blocked so no one in Australia can see it. We're taking that case on with the help of ADF, who brought the case to us, and are going to challenge the right of the E-Safety Commissioner to use that law to shut down political speech and important speech that is there trying to defend children from a movement that seeks to medicalise them unnecessarily. But even more scary than that are other cases being brought against the E-Safety Commissioner, because it turns out that even if you don't meet the very low bar test that is in that law for cyber abuse of an Australian adult, if the E-Safety Commissioner has any concerns about a post that you've made, they've been issuing informal takedown notices to social media companies on a regular basis, despite the fact that it doesn't meet the legal requirement. This is the kind of activism that these unaccountable bodies often undertake and are such a threat to free speech on such important issues.
I think that I want to emphasize what I imagine people listening might think, well, none of this concerns me because I'm a nice person and I don't commit hate speech and I like to tell the truth, so I don't share misinformation. I certainly don't cyber abuse people or anything else. And really the common thread through the cases that we've talked about and this whole area of law is that you, the individual, you don't get to define any of these terms. And so what you think in terms of what hate speech is or misinformation is doesn't really matter. You're not the one in power. And so these laws, and all of them, they all carry the same pattern, extremely vaguely worded. They ban misinformation, they don't define it. They ban hate speech, they don't define it. And then we see that these laws are then turned against those who, yeah, they think they're a nice person, but they're the ones on the receiving end of these laws They're the ones who find themselves with a knock at the door, the police and so forth saying, well, actually, you have committed hate speech. And so I think that it's a huge threat. It might seem abstract to people because they might think that they're not going to be impacted. But all of that, our cases and our clients that we've seen, these are just regular people just trying to peacefully live out their faith. And they have found themselves in the crosshairs of these laws over a period of time. And so I think it's important to underscore this, that if you're just a regular member of the public just trying to live out your life, that these laws can and perhaps will affect you at some point in the future.
I think it's also important to point out that many of them actually can create convictions or civil penalties if you're just in mere possession of something that a government authority thinks is hate speech. And so if you think about that in a social media world, something comes across your feed and you save it. Or, for example, you forward it on, not thinking it's a funny joke. That in and of itself can cause you to be under investigation. And again, that process is a part of the punishment. We're also seeing that in the United States. California passed a law recently in the election season, essentially saying that if you forward a parody that could harm a politician's reputation, that you're breaking California law by doing that. And so again, this can just not even simply be something that you created, but something you passively received.
Paul, you've recently written that you're now seeing the different attitudes in Europe and America on religious freedom as constituting a fundamental split in the Western world. I guess that's in some ways what the Vice President was referring to. What did you mean, if we could just drill into that a bit more for a moment?
So I think up until the recent election of President Trump, there was a lot of uniformity in the West regarding censorship, and perhaps not in the US so overtly because of the First Amendment, but certainly this collusion that we've been talking about between government and big tech and so forth. We saw that play out across the European Union and around the Anglosphere. What we've seen from the beginning of 2025, and really Vice President Vance's speech really hit the nail on the head, is a fundamentally different approach now coming out of the US, recommitting to its free speech heritage. And then predictably, at the same time that happens, those political elites and others in Europe and across the Anglosphere then doubling down on censorship. And this is what is creating this divide. I've been referring to it now as essentially a new, almost like a digital iron curtain that's coming down across the West from those who now perhaps might find themselves in free speech jurisdictions, the US, and those of us in Europe and elsewhere where we're living under a context that we will not be able to receive the same information, and we certainly won't be able to impart it.
Paul, we're seeing endless discussion about the dreaded dangers, imagined and real, of Islamophobia from Western political leaders. It's particularly the case in Britain, and it seems to be in response, frankly, to what might almost be described as Islamophobia on behalf of some political leaders and prosecutors and so forth who have not been brave enough to expose the bad behaviour of some Muslim people. Let's be really honest about this. But what's all this about? And why is it being bandied around so much? The assumption underlying it is that we're all a bunch of people who'll hate Muslims.
Yeah, the phrase is relatively recent in the English language, and it is essentially a trump card that's laid to shut down debate around this issue. And so, and it's not just Islamophobia, it's all the phobias. This is the recent phenomenon. If you call something a phobia, then you are given permission to shut down conversation and debate around it. And so that's exactly what we're seeing in the UK. It's a way to silence opponents, silence important conversations that need to be had. And as it seems the theme of this conversation, it's another term or phrase that is almost without definition, and it's increasingly being used, therefore, to just silence and censor people who have an alternative viewpoint. And now we're seeing the British government is essentially creating this council on Islamophobia, which many people including myself, believe is essentially reintroducing, or will reintroduce, the concept of blasphemy for the 21st century. And I think it will therefore represent a huge threat to freedom of speech as they consider anyone who says anything critical or points anything out that the conversations that need to be had is committing Islamophobia or blasphemy.
This is all becoming so absolutely top-heavy that you wonder how long it'll be before there will be simply a massive pushback against the overreach in our cultures. Or are we just being so dulled? Do we feel so powerless that this bullying will just continue?
We see these tensions happening right now, and you see them happening in the UK, and we saw what happened in Southport with this horrific stabbing, the reaction of the public to speak out against what they saw taking place on their streets, and then this huge crackdown by police, threatening people. We saw huge police coming on television, social media posts and so forth. They filmed the arrests, went around with cameras filming arrests to let everyone know that if you say anything out of line, that the police are coming for you. It's this great theatre. And you can see in that they themselves are terrified that they are not going to be able to ultimately censor and silence people enough, and you can almost see this tension. And again, that was something that Vice President Vance alluded to, the idea that European leaders don't trust their people with speech, and I think he was absolutely right to say that. And I think that there is this great fear that the people cannot be trusted in case they come to the wrong conclusions. And I think it's my prediction that we're going to see that play out in the months ahead. To what end, I don't know.
Two broad issues then to raise with each of you as we come into land. Firstly, and John, you've spoken about this in Australia, but I'd be interested in other perspectives. As you take on these cases, many of them you win essentially because they're vexatious, but the process has been the punishment. Nonetheless, you're building up a precedent, or a set of precedents. What patterns are emerging around what can be won and what's hopeless?
Well, I'll start us off
as you
on that.
defend people.
I think that the gender ideology movement is a great example in terms of what's happening in the US and also abroad. But when we started that, there were very few that were willing to speak out on the fact that men can't become women. And there were 3 high school track girls that stood up and said, no, men can't become women, and these boys shouldn't be competing against us and taking 4 state championships and 15 titles. As a result, more people started hearing those stories. Legislators in other states heard the stories, and they said, we don't want this to happen here. Other women began to hear and start to put together, wait a minute, if gender identity moves forward, it will be women and girls who suffer the most because there are legitimate biological distinctions. We litigated these cases for over 10 years and these issues, and that's nothing compared to what we see someone like William Wilberforce, who spent 40 years to prevail. But the principle is true that courage begets courage. And so one more instance, we've had 15 victories at the US Supreme Court in the last 12 years. And one of those, though, started almost at our very beginning, 30 years ago. It was a case called Hurley, and it involved free speech. The most recent case we have won on free speech was 303 Creative on behalf of a Christian who said, I can't write custom websites that violate my convictions and express a view of marriage that I believe isn't true and is also harmful. Hurley was cited over 30 times in 303 Creative. So each one of us has an obligation and a privilege to stand in these moments for our rights. And we shouldn't just think about it as for ourselves, but for future generations. So I am filled with great hope about what the future holds. We've talked about Dunkirk, and we know that more and more people are getting fed up. And so again, I would just emphasize, there will be some who suffer. There already have been some who have suffered in that 30-year battle that we had in the US. Some people have lost reputations. Some people have lost businesses and vocations. But in the end, they won because we preserved this, we changed the law of a nation, and we continue to have the most robust free speech laws in the world. So I think we can do it, and I know that God will go before us to do it because we're on the side of truth.
Building up some decent legal precedents in Australia, do you think?
Yeah, the core impetus for our work is to help Christians who face hostility for their faith. But a large part of the cases that we take are that we want to establish strategic precedents that are going to change the law in Australia and are also going to change the culture. They're going to resonate within the wider culture to show that when you are impinging on free speech and freedom of religion, there are real people who are facing real penalties for it. And so even now, the cases that we've run and that we've won have been precedents that have been referred to in other cases. And so when the law is weaponised against Christians, we want to make sure that we run the best cases with the best experts and the best counsel, the best barristers, so that we can set a high bar so that when the next person comes through and the law is weaponised against them, that they have something to rely on, that they have a precedent that is going to help them to be able to defend their speech. And that is going to be the way that we ensure that Australian laws effectively protect religious freedom.
Well, I think I'm already encouraged. I mentioned the case of Päivärasen. That's been ongoing for 5 years, and it does take a toll. But we've also won that case twice, both at the lower court and at the appeals court. That involves 6 judges, unanimous acquittal on both occasions. So I'm hopeful going into the Supreme Court case that she will be acquitted a third and final time, that it will set a great precedent for Finland and also signal a message to other European countries. We've also seen success in some of these free speech cases in the UK. For example, Isabel Vaughan-Spruce, who was arrested last year for silent prayer. Not only was she acquitted, we successfully sued the police, which is not easy to do in a British context, and she was paid out compensation for her treatment. So we have seen pockets of victory amongst what is a very difficult battle. But actually for us in Europe, and I think probably is the case in Australia, it will take more actually than just winning in court, because these laws that we have, these hate speech laws and misinformation laws, if we win in these cases, even if we set positive precedents, which we are doing and will continue to do, we have to address the fact that these cases are being brought in the first place. And to address that fully, we have to think about real legislative reform. We have to think about repealing a lot of these laws, or at least significantly reforming them so that they have meaningful language within them and not these ridiculous and vague concepts that lead to the prosecutions in the first place. People might think that that is impossible, can't be done. But that's nonsense, because these laws have all cropped up almost in my lifetime. So I refuse to accept. Here in England, we have a legal tradition uninterrupted for almost 1,000 years. I refuse to accept that something that's cropped up in my lifetime, that I'm going to be stuck with it now for the next 1,000 years. And so it is going to take a lot of work, but that's why all of our organisations exist, to be able to support this work, to defend freedom of religion, freedom of speech.
Well, thank you very much for your time. The law can be onerously expensive, and many of your clients are not wealthy people. They're often little people, and I don't mean that in a patronising sense, who are attacked by people who have a lot more resources than they do. Presumably, you will need financial resources so that you can go into bat for people who can't pay for their own defences. I'm just going to say that we will put up, as I conclude now, whatever you give us in terms of how people can get on your website and seek to support your very important work in the interests of freedom and our civilisation.